and welcome to CORFAC International's 2021 Virtual Spring Conference. I am your 2021 CORFAC International President, Joe Latina, a principal here with Patterson Woods Commercial Properties, CORFAC International in Wilmington, Delaware. So before we jump into today's session, I'm going to take a few seconds to talk about the CORFAC app. So if you haven't downloaded it yet, I highly encourage you to do so. I do use it regularly, and that's no bull. I whenever I need to call somebody, it's just a lot easier for me to go right to the phone, pop open the link, search one of our members, and have all his contact information right on my hand. And I usually call right from the app, and it really is a quick and easy way, to get access to your colleagues. I encourage you to download it. I use it to search properties. I use it to look at some CORFAC, recent transactions and a whole lot more. So conveniently, if you look at your email right now, you will have just received an email from headquarters at about 15, 20 minutes ago regarding the app. It is an email that you can click on and download the app while we're talking this morning. And you have it at your disposal at that point. If you have any questions, concerns, or issues, you can reach directly out to headquarters. They're more than willing to help you with that. So again, I encourage everyone to download the app. It's right on your email as of this morning. So that's my little pitch about the app. As we get started into our speaker, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Greg Lindsay, who will share his insights on leading trends affecting commercial real estate. Backed by popular demand, Greg has presented to CORFAC at past events, and we've enjoyed his forward-looking approach to the key drivers of our industry. Before we begin, I would like to thank our session sponsor and our industry partner, BuildOut. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce the man with the greatest name in real estate, Chris Crisco from BuildOut. Chris is joining us this morning, and I'm going to give him a few minutes here to talk about BuildOut. Chris.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. I'll make it quick here for everybody's benefit so we could jump into the session. First off, I just wanted to thank everybody for, really being friends of BuildOuts throughout the years. Jonathan, Diane, Christy, Jennifer, of course, Joe. Pleasure to have gotten closer with you and understand your business over the years. It's been an absolute pleasure. Whether you're a new customer of ours, a longtime customer, or not a customer at all, you've all been incredibly kind to me and to our company over the years. And, reflecting back on the last year, I'm proud to say that through the rough year of COVID, we were able to keep every single teammate on board. Prioritizing the mental health of our employees over the the health of our bottom line. And the only reason we were able to do that is because folks like you, stuck with us through the tough times. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for that. Just a quick kind of catch you up on what we're doing. Last summer, we brought on a new equity partner that we're really excited about, and we've already started doing some interesting things. We've hired over 20 people since the new year. There are over 100 employees at BuildOut right now, and we're planning to hire another 20 to 25 in Q2. So we're growing, and we're back into go after the market mode. We recently acquired a new commercial real estate CRM called Rethink. We'll be integrating their product into our offering and providing more CRM optionality to you folks that are BuildOut customers that want to integrate either a simple CRM or a more complex CRM. Both of those options will be available. In April, we're going to launch a new financial underwriting tool that many of our users are excited about. This has been a challenge in BuildOut for years, and this will solve that challenge. In June, for you RCM, or Real Capital Markets users out there, we are bringing to market a competitive product at a much lower price point that will be called BuildOut Boost. And the intention there is to give you some advanced marketing functionality that hopefully your clients will enjoy, and also targeted leads based on the assets that you're taking to market. We're investing a whole lot in the core marketing products. So those of you that have been with us for years, expect to see some changes, and some good changes that I think your marketers, your brokers, and your managing brokers are really going to appreciate. And there will be more acquisitions. So some of those folks that are in your conference today, there's a chance some of those folks are a part of the build out team. Those conversations are continuing. Our mission in this industry is to become the premier software provider for commercial real estate brokerage, bar none. The number of companies are shrinking as they acquire folks, but we really feel like we have a really unique advantage, specifically in the brokerage world, where while other companies are kind of coming in and looking to disintermediate some portion of the broker and their transactions, build out is not. And we're really excited to continue creating value for all of you, hopefully. And again, just thank you very much for sticking with us. We're happy to be here and hope we can continue to provide value for years. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very, very much, Chris. And yes, I can say we are a build out firm ourselves, and we couldn't be happier with the product. And it's fantastic. You guys continue to reinvent yourself. So good stuff there, Chris. Thank you very much. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Mr. Greg Lindsay. Greg is a journalist, urbanist, futurist, and speaker. Currently serves as the director of applied research at New Cities, a global nonprofit organization committed to shaping a better urban future. Greg's research is concentrated in wide ranges of areas, including technology and data, urban development, sustainability, and more. Greg is a frequent author for Fast Company and INC, Inc., as we well know it, magazine, and he is featured in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, CNN, NPR, and many, many other major media outlets. That's all I got for you, Greg. Be sure to share any questions you may have with Greg in the chat, and keep yourself muted, please, during this presentation. Now, please join me in welcoming Greg Lindsay. Greg.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back to complete the CORFAC trilogy. 2 bits of housekeeping notes before we begin, because I wish I was standing in front of you in San Diego or Phoenix, but alas, here we are in Zoom world. So one, apologies for any lag in there when you're running this many peripherals off a single port on a MacBook Air. That it kind of comes and goes. And second, I would encourage all of you to change the view on Zoom to speaker if you haven't already, because rather than share my screen here, I've got some nifty software where I'm just going to shrink myself down and you can look at me and my slides at the same time here as we get to it. So with that, let's get started, because if there's one thing I can do, it's deliver an hour-long talk in 45 minutes or less. I've spent the last year, it's been 2 years since I last stood before you in Phoenix, good 2-year intervals here. And I think I spent the last year, like most of you, wondering what the hell just happened to everything, and to what extent, we're going to see permanent changes. And, I'm an urbanist at heart. I'm ultimately caring about what happens to cities and the dynamics of cities, real estate, of course, being one of the most critical pieces of that. And the last year has been trying one, especially with this narrative that cities are done, that they're over, that we're going to see a flight from cities, and that no one would ever want to live in a dense urban place ever again. And in the early days, of course, that was about fears of contagion, which I think has relaxed somewhat. But, this was a time a year ago, and I remember thinking about this, we saw, of course, large employers that had spent, huge amounts on building urban offices and mixed use projects, of course, instantly abandoning their entire footprints, the bank CEOs, the tech CEOs, declaring this. And I still am skeptical about this. This is the most viral tweet I ever had here about, the fact that, these companies realizing that, that work from home was an opportunity to offload their real estate portfolios and make us absorb that. Well, that ties into one of the trends I'm going to talk about. And, also a year ago, we saw, I was following the dueling philosophical debates between Glenn Kelman at Redfin and his counterpart at Zillow here. This was back in June here, Kelman arguing this. More recently, he just said, for example, that given, and I'll show some slides in a minute, what we're seeing in the housing markets, that housing has become a luxury good, that, that basically declaring the end of homeownership as we know it. And of course, Zillow is taking a more cautious stance and has that, yeah, we're seeing people look around, we're going to see people move, but they're not necessarily going to flee cities. And I think it is interesting. There's statistics, or at least there's polls coming out of NPD Group, that 28% of Americans are currently thinking about moving. They expect this to translate perhaps to a 20% annualized increase in the number of American moves. So things are in flux, to say the least. All of us who are fortunate enough to live in Zoom world here, of course, it's a good thing to keep in mind that we are the fortunate ones. We are the non-essential workers who get to reside in our homes and continue to work on this. And that's why I'm also very interested, very skeptical when we talk about, the future is all Zoom and all remote work, and that real estate assets will matter less. And it's because, of course, this is a very privileged conversation. It applies to a very discrete portion of the American workforce. But we've seen over the past year, and this is right, we'll come back to this here, is that, I think housing has moved to center stage here. We've seen over the last year, for example, and I've been working on several projects for one of America's largest home builders, one of its largest mixed use developers, a major interiors brand, trying to puzzle through this. And yeah, it's interesting to me that, that housing has, of course, absorbed so many functions, and therefore it's led to this run on housing. So this is, of course, data from Altos Research, Mike Sorensen, showing that, this plummet in inventory. Here you can sort of see it in metros across the country as it drops. This is from Len Kiefer at Freddie Mac, I think just today or very recently here, showing that, if you visualize it, the usual levels of housing vacancy and then compare it to supply, that if, in the housing bubble of the late 2000s, we had a sort of vast oversupply in housing. Now we currently seem to have a vast undersupply of housing. And that's of course led to this divergence of rents and home prices. This is where sort of the end of cities debate has ended up, that this paradoxical twist that even supposedly as people are fleeing these wealthy gateway markets, which is leading rents to plunge, the values of their real estate has, climbed precipitously at the same time, which I think is really interesting because it shows again, the value of the assets, even if people are temporarily moving to the Hamptons or Palm Beach or, any other destination you've read. And this translates to data. I'll show some slides from Brookings as well. If you know me from my previous appearances here, is that, I still believe, and the data still continues to support, although this is 2018 data, that office and retail in walkable areas is primed to hold its value basically more tenaciously than more suburban areas. So when it comes to the future of the office, for example, I think, that basically we'll see, rents fall in CBDs and we'll see downtowns take a hit, but it's the suburban office parks and those really sort of, tertiary areas that are really going to take the hit. And we're gonna have to think about what those become converted to, which is sort of what I'll talk a bit about in a little bit here. But this is of course all part of the so-called K-shaped recovery, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Economists love to use letter forms for this. And yeah, the rich of course have gotten richer in this and the poor have gotten poorer in this incredible divergence that we've seen here, where of course it hasn't really been a recession at all for those of us in the fortunate top half of the K. And this is of course, I think driving of course the rush to homeownership and a lot of these other trends. So I'm paradoxically, I'm going to speak to a commercial real estate crowd here about housing, because this is the sort of conclusion that I've come to during the pandemic, that the pandemic era necessity of everything becoming housing is of course going to have lingering after effects when it comes to CRE, particularly in the sense of you now compete with housing. And so as an example of this, this is a stylized version of my home throughout the pandemic. This is a stylized version of my wife, Sophie Donaldson, who's the former editor-in-chief of House Beautiful magazine. She wrote this a year ago for the New York Times here about the fact that like now is not the time to make your home Instagram. And this is sort of where we're still at a year later for many of us who are unvaccinated, and even those of us who are. The fact that home and housing has had to interiorize, live, work, school, play, all of these various uses here in ways they were never intended to. And you see this, the time that we've all spent commuting to our offices, well, parents and non-parents alike have given back half of that to more working. E-commerce, of course, a decade's worth of change literally overnight, as we've seen here. And data by McKinsey and others has shown that, that basically people will continue to advance their habits in these areas afterwards, which of course has, and I'll come back to it again, huge implications for high street retail and that's piece of mixed use projects as well. So, all of these various categories where people have basically turned their homes into loading docks. And you can see here that curbside pickup is becoming part of the norm. People have still dabbled with meal kit delivery and grocery delivery as well, but we're seeing, the huge wave of IPOs that have happened with DoorDash, with Instacart preparing to go next. And I'll come back to their spatial strategies in a bit. But this gets back to, I think, some of the interesting paradoxes in housing that's happened over the years. So, again, coming back to sort of the Brookings data I was showing earlier, we're all no strangers to the oversizing of the American home, right? The decline in 2 bedrooms and 1 bedrooms and the growth of 3 and 4 bedrooms. We also know that, basically according to American demographics, and I've spent some of the time in between talking to you, writing a whole report on where millennial families are most likely to live. We've seen that millennial family composition will change. There's going to be a lot more single child and childless families are going to move into this housing. And so, as of a year ago, we were talking about this massive housing glut that was existing everywhere, that, all these underutilized bedrooms that were going to be out there. And, here you can see that basically the bigger the house, the more likely they are to have an underutilized bedroom. Well, if the world of remote work continues to happen, which I think it will to some extent, we've seen overwhelmingly in surveys. I believe JLL had, I think it was 72% of workers want to work from home at least 1 day a week. That this will become increasingly utilized by other options here. This has happened, of course, Airbnb pivoting quickly from a dense urban metro tourism strategy to almost something approaching short to intermediate stay housing here with their approach. The idea that, that basically housing will turn into a portfolio of places that you'll work from. I think as Brian Chesky put it at some point, you'll work from home, but it'll be someone else's home. We've seen Lennar, originally created their next-gen housing variant for millennial families to be granny flats or to be Airbnb renters. They're continuing to roll this out. These are some of the new designs. This is a townhouse concept in Los Angeles. We're imagining, basically private bedrooms that can be turned into office suites. This is one for the Inland Empire, which I think is really interesting because you can easily imagine a combination of a house, home office setup, and Airbnb or granny flat property all in one kind of thing. So we're seeing these homes are starting to absorb these uses, and we're starting to see designs for this. And Lennar, like many others, is responding to this notion of that homeownership is a luxury, no longer attainable for the middle class. We've seen this huge explosion of interest into single family rental. This trend, of course, goes back to the financial crisis, Open Door and others with the iBuyers, and then, of course, Blackstone and American Homes for Rent and all these companies building these huge asset portfolios. Well, now we're starting to see we've reached the point of saturation and, of course, this housing shortage where now this is starting to be built custom. And this is where we come back to this idea that, that housing is beginning to absorb internalizing services into it, that mixed use in many ways and commercial use is becoming like fractalized. Every house is potentially a mixed use housing project. And so, I look at these, images now, this is the North Dallas suburbs, and I'll come back to this, thinking about these as they go, every one of these is an office, a house, again, a loading dock, all these sort of capabilities folded into one. And I think this will get more interesting actually for denser suburbs and cities as well, because one of the trends that's played out over the last year is that Portland, Sacramento, Berkeley, California have all joined Minneapolis in basically eliminating single family zoning. Allowing for duplexes, triplexes, and other sorts of combinations of housing. So at the same time that we're seeing homes internalize these uses, we're starting to see a relaxed zoning, which is allowing other possible recombinations and other units. And so one example I think of this is, and this is the trend that I've been following, is sort of like thinking about like everything as a service and housing as a service, and imagining the sort of commercial layer being added to housing. So in addition to single family rental as an asset class out there, you're starting to see companies actually deliver services to it. One of which, for example, is health. I was just reading about, I literally was just reading about it in Fast Company today, so the name escapes me, but a 2,000 unit multi-building, multi-family developer has started offering telemedicine as an amenity to its residents there. And as you can see in this McKinsey chart, this recent huge report that just dropped on the future of work is that healthcare is going to be one of those services that will continue to be done in person, will continue to see a growth in employment, and also other forms of managed care. So I've been following, for example, Common, the co-living company founded by Brad Hargreaves, did a deal 2 years ago with Tishman Speyer to create KIN, childcare as a service, starting in a couple of buildings in Brooklyn and Queens. This is the idea of layering a digital service layer, an app over on top of housing designed for young families, but also providing lists of vetted nannies and other kinds of available peer-to-peer services catering to this crowd. And I start to think about this. This is a trend we can discuss in Q&A, but this is part of a whole overarching trend where property owners increasingly are going to have to add these digital service layers and increase levels of management, community managers that came out of co-working, workplace design managers, et cetera. A few have already done this. Tishman Speyer, I'm sure, opted into this because they created Zoe, which is already their managed one. There's some other platforms in Europe like District Technologies that I followed as well. But I also think of something, the interesting sort of hybrids are going to come out of this when it comes to commercial. Like this is a project friends of mine are developing at MIT called Care House. This is the first prototype that's being developed in Baltimore. It's basically multi-generational senior housing and affordable housing together with a retail component on the ground floor. And it's expressly designed to basically sort of better integrating seniors into their communities, which, we all know about the silver tsunami and the demographic changes that are coming. And I think it's really interesting of like, how do you basically create a place where, middle-aged people needing affordable housing can be caregivers and be employed to people who need it even more than them. And this gets to, I guess, sort of a larger trend in a way of thinking about like the fact that, I think how we think about office and retail and particularly how we compose larger projects has changed. I use the phrase like instead of a flight to quality after the pandemic, we're going to see a flight to foot traffic. Like we're going to build programs around what is it people actually want to do. If they can do work from home and they can do retail from home, what is it they can't do from home that they want to see? And I think one of those is going to be, they want to be with other people. They want to get out there and be in a place where they can drink outdoors and be around other people. And that's why one of the projects I flagged as of interest is this is Hub 121 in McKinney, Texas, of course, near the WPGA golf course there. This is next door to a multifamily residential building. And then here they're starting with basically, I think, 4 10,000 square feet plus concepts, as you can see in the rendering, of brew houses and barbecue and everything else. And then around that, they're surrounding it with shared workspaces. Serendipity Labs signed a 27,000 square foot lease there. Sorry, any audio troubles? I'm looking at my presentation. I just heard some echo. All right, interrupt me if you lose me or call me or something. So anyway, so I think of that, and then I think of also projects, this is in the suburbs of Phoenix in Tempe, right across the river. This is a project called Cul-de-sac. It's being developed for $175 million by a team that's moved there from Silicon Valley. And the idea of what they've done there is they basically have won the battle to remove all parking from the site and turn them into 90,000 square feet of amenities. So food trucks, yoga lessons, public plazas, giving that back as semi-public space, and then basically integrating mobility as a service into it. I'm a major fan of mobility, so here they're going to be providing on-site scooters and electric bicycles. There's basically a light rail stop outside. And so the idea is creating a combination self-contained neighborhood, but also, providing all these services in lieu of parking to that as well. And so limiting to the extent to which you even have to leave the property. And that's a trend I'll come back to in a moment. But first I want to touch upon this demographic spread, all these Americans want to move, is leading some really interesting changes. And I think is going to sort of pave the way for the future of economic development. So coming back to Common and Kin for a moment, I don't have any renderings to show. I would have put it up here, but they recently held a competition to create what they called a remote work hub. The idea of thinking through these new typologies of housing and working all together. And so they put together a blue ribbon team and they awarded developers in 5 cities. And I thought the 5 were really interesting there. New Orleans was the largest. The others were Bentonville, Arkansas, of course, home of Walmart, which is, offering $10,000 to people to move there. Ogden, Utah, Rochester, New York, and one escapes me. But these, but to me, what's really interesting is that, these smaller cities that are projected to be the beneficiaries of people leaving coastal metros for cheaper housing costs. And, I talked to the developer of the New Orleans project. It's called NOLA Workstyle. And again, what he's developing is not just a multifamily apartment building that has home offices in it, but actually creating managed services. There will be bookable conference rooms. There will be concierges. His ground floor tenant is going to be a daycare. So basically tenants of the building will have preferential treatment into housing their children on site. And again, I think it's really interesting that all these components that were bundled inside of CRE is now becoming unbundled and rebundled around a lot of housing. And this, of course, is leading to geographic spreads as well. You've probably followed the whole Miami meme trend, which is the idea that everybody in Silicon Valley and everywhere else is moving to Austin and or Miami. This is Mayor Francis Suarez. We're hosting him on the Commotion podcast next week here. The charming young mayor who doesn't have that much power because that's Miami-Dade, but has been out there very active on Twitter and recruiting, CEOs and venture capitalists and allowing you to pay your parking tickets in Bitcoin. And of course, turning it into this sort of, bro paradise here where all the VCs are hanging out. And I think it's really interesting because the idea of what he's doing is that it's the realization that economic development in a post-pandemic era is no longer about giving subsidies to firms to build a warehouse or move an office there. You're battling for the individual hearts and minds of remote workers to basically set up shop in your city. And so what kind of amenities can you offer them? In some ways, it goes back to Richard Florida's creative class hypothesis, and he just co-wrote a huge essay about this in the Wall Street Journal. But I think what I think is going to be interesting is that we're going to have to see cities are going to have to partner with real estate developers and partner with all sorts of other services to position themselves as attractive and figure out what those assets are. So many people might be attracted to Miami, a place with sunny beaches and of course low taxes and a business-friendly environment, which is pretty much the opposite of where I chose to move, which was Montreal, where Quebec hates foreigners and basically it's all bureaucracy. But we've seen other cities, for example, like Tallinn in Estonia, which of course has positioned itself as a major tech magnet. They spent last year rolling out the world's first digital nomad visa, which is the idea that you could live for a year in Estonia as long as you work for someone else and they pay your salary to basically keep the tax situation separate. Estonia has been joined by 20 other countries. Many of them are in the Caribbean that have done it to replace their tourism. But one of the ones I think is really interesting is like Helsinki, another snowy city across the strait there from Tallinn, introduced a free 90-day Fin program where they basically advertise to technology workers. And here you can sort of see their pitch there. Instead of moving to low taxes, you could move to a city where everything simply works, is their definition of it, where they'll help put your children into the schools and so on and so on. And I just think this is interesting here because, again, this comes back to, and this is a project I'm trying to develop at New Cities right now, about the fact that we're going to have to sort of see these sort of integrated offerings where cities are going to have to partner much more closely with these kinds of, with landlords, with other things to offer these amenities, to make sure that startups that are arriving in Miami, for example, have access to offices. They cut a deal with WeWork where they're going to provide free space to startups, and where SoftBank has created a $100 million fund specifically for startups. It helps that the CEO of SoftBank and chairman of WeWork live in Miami, but how are other cities going to compete with this? And so that, to me, I think is one of the really interesting post-pandemic questions about, how are people going to go shopping for their next location? So shifting gears a little bit here, sort of the counter trend of the idea of fleeing the city is what we call at New Cities the proximity city. This is the trend of the so-called 15-minute city that you might have heard of. Others talk about 30-minute cities, 5-minute cities, 1-minute cities. But this idea, this reaction against the pandemic where, maybe we will leave our houses after this, but we're not going to stray too far from home. We're never certainly going to drive an hour each way ever again, 5 days a week. I do think that trend actually is legitimately dead and never should have existed in the first place. The idea of working from the same container 5 days a week, no matter what you have to get done, was always kind of crazy on its face. But this is an idea that comes out of Paris, where of course, living in central Paris, not really much of a hardship, but it's this idea that, all the essential services you should have in your life should be within a 15-minute walk or bicycle ride. And this, of course, would require that instead of you being able to commute to any point in the city, depending on what you need, you would have to basically bring that to you. And that, of course, would in turn require very flexible forms of real estate and street use and everything else. And so you can see in this bucolic image, they will apparently, dig up the streets and put in streams somehow there. But, we've seen in cities across the United States, New York being one where, outdoor dining has been allowed. And we've seen restaurants and other commercial tenants put up real estate effectively in the streets. And I think that's where this trend starts to get really interesting, is because the hard line before of private real estate and the public realm has blurred in very interesting and potentially value additive ways. So in Stockholm, for example, the Vinnova, which is their national innovation agency, the Swedes are taking very much advantage of the fact that they have nationally defined street space and nationally defined parking spaces. So they've created these wooden prototype places for seating and scooter places and everything else, where they can install that into streets very flexibly. And we recently had a masterclass with Dan Hill, who's sort of the mastermind behind this. And he took it a step further, where one of the things that they're trying to do, and this diagram is probably hard to read, but they're actually trying to create like an open source model of a kit of parts, an IKEA version of urbanism that can be assembled in streets and disassembled as needed. And this gets back to like the flight to foot traffic. How do you basically create new forms in public space that could provide value to your actual commercial property? And I think there's some really potentially fruitful collaborations between cities and commercial real estate owners here on like how to position yourselves for this and how to make yourselves open to having the cities make investments in those, at least the ones who are really progressive. And again, this comes back to the notion of like, how do you make a place better? How do you increase that foot traffic if that's where it's going to go? I worked on a project. This is basically the Champs-Élysées in Paris. I was part of the team that advised the winning architect, Philippe Chiambretta Architects, to rethink it ahead of the 2024 Olympics. And so we basically took out most of the traffic, as you can see. We put in all new layers of trees. We basically put in all sorts of other services and amenities on top of it. And take a look at this beautiful vista here. But what to me was really interesting is the reason we did it is because effectively the business improvement district behind the Champs-Élysées, did it because people hate the Champs-Élysées. This is sort of their surveys. You can see here that avenue, which has some of the highest value real estate in the entirety of France, is basically despised by Parisians. They consider it a tourist trap effectively. And so the entire project was about, how do we, again, bring back residents? How do we increase the value of it? And the fact that it's, going ahead during a pandemic is sort of telling there, because it's sort of a strategy to replace all those missing tourists. But it's interesting a way to think about, how are we going to reposition cities, and how are we going to sort of, make places attractive to people if they're no longer commuting 60 minutes across the city. Here you can see some of the various point-to-points within Los Angeles. And this also matters because, cities are completely, and this is one of the trends, sadly, that I think will outlast the pandemic, those dense cities where, are the ones that are facing the steepest shortfalls in public transit. I mean, Manhattan, the Bay Area, they literally are compact spaces that require those public transit systems to move people into those office towers. And, effectively, it's a, they're seeing worst case ridership levels that are falling off faster than they ever could have imagined. So this is BART, for example. Their worst case scenario is actually, turns out to be worse every single time they look at it. And so here, we've seen, this is Mayor Claudia Lopez in Bogota. One of her solutions is to basically pivot the entire city towards bicycle ridership. We had her on our masterclass recently. She mentioned her ambitious plan to basically do 50% of all trips in the South American capital by bicycle by 2040. This is while they're building a metro. And I only bring this up because 50% is higher than Copenhagen or Amsterdam, but also it's in lieu of the fact that their bus network is falling apart and they actually haven't built a train. So it's a very canny political strategy. And, and again, it's probably outside your portfolios, but we're seeing Germany and others are actually seeing huge growth in e-bikes and sort of reconfiguring people's mobility habits around this. And here you can sort of see, this is sort of the Bogota plan to think about how they're going to do street closures and traffic calming. But this is where things get really interesting, because the companies that are really interested in a proximity city, that are really assembling the portfolios, are some of the big platform delivery companies and some of the other retailer giants. So the person you're looking at right now is Matt Newberg. He's the proprietor of a great newsletter called Hungry, which I would recommend you all read, hngry.tv. I'm a subscriber. It's basically tracking all of the rise of so-called cloud kitchens and ghost restaurants and dark stores. He went undercover as an Amazon Prime delivery person. Amazon basically opened up its new Amazon Fresh format stores in Los Angeles during the pandemic and made them available for delivery 2 months before you could actually set foot in the physical store. So one of the things that Matt found when he was going there is that basically, that Amazon had embraced the 15-city model. It was basically assembling its real estate portfolios in highly dense, high-income neighborhoods across, the Southland, where it could basically do all these deliveries in under a mile. And so this is him basically tracing out his delivery radius here, noting that he never went more than a mile over the course of the 2 days that he went undercover. What was also interesting when he delved into this, and I'm doing some reporting on this as well, is that basically Amazon, when opening these fresh stores, the stores are a hybrid of micro-fulfillment center and retail, and that it's designed to basically flex over time. So, the back 20% for now is the delivery hub and the 80% is retail in front, but they're actually changing physical store layouts based on incoming data to make it easier for the pickers to pack those orders and send them out. And I think this is going to be one of the really interesting wrinkles that's happening post-pandemic is that commercial real estate itself is becoming mixed use inside and becoming hyper flexible. And those uses are changing moment to moment based on these incoming data streams and e-commerce models. And so, so DoorDash, for example, which of course went public, I forget their valuation now, but, they've put together a whole hybrid portfolio of spaces where, here you're seeing one of their branded, owned, leased spaces. I think it's just leased, of course, former warehouse in Southern California, but they've also actually signed spaces or signed capacity for delivery inside converted restaurants that have become part of these sort of ghost restaurant networks that are out there. Travis Kalanick, who left Uber, created cloud kitchens, which is another version of outfitting very tertiary spaces in urban cores and make them available to entrepreneurs who want to open restaurants that are only available on delivery platforms like DoorDash or Uber Eats. Let me show you the exterior of one of Travis's prized real estate portfolios. This is what it looks like from the outside. Now, to me, this is really interesting because, of course, this is still fairly high value real estate. It's very centrally located. But by basically compressing the entire customer interface below the app by using contract gig delivery workers, it allows them to change the entire equation of how the real estate is used. And, I'm not sure this has great implications for most of you, but I think it's incredibly fascinating that they're using this proprietary data, which they get through the app themselves, to understand customer locations and then basically sort of seek out undervalued real estate and then convert it into this. And, they're not even the most ambitious player out there. Reef Technology, which has $1 billion from SoftBank, is basically trying to reinvent real estate altogether. They're the ones who bought up 4,500 parking lots across the United States and are now deploying these deceptively shipping container-looking structures, starting with meal delivery kits. They're also doing COVID tests and even vaccinations at this point. But Reef's ambitions go a lot further than that. In conversations I've had with them, effectively what they're trying to do is create new combinations of modular, flexible, mixed-use projects that can be deployed to the edges of cities. Their idea, and this comes where sort of the name proximity city comes from, is that rather than traveling to an area or a district that to your doctor's visit, or even doing it via telehealth, I suppose, you would have one available in every neighborhood, in every corner. And so they've partnered with Cardinal Health that is basically seeing this as a reinvention of the medical clinic. And so it's, again, this sort of massive decentralization and de-aggregation. And the real estate product itself is they're trying to create new structures from scratch where every layer of it, whether it's the flooring, whether it's the internals, whether it's the cladding and the branding, can be basically dismantled, taken out, and reestablished as it goes. And so trying to create something that is ultra hyper flexible and redeployable. And this, I should just add, is really interesting because it comes out of the WeWork diaspora. All those people who got laid off from WeWork a year and a half ago are now launching startups and working together on this. And some of the research projects I've been doing, everyone has a WeWork alumnus attached to this, because these various projects about thinking about how do you vastly roll out all of these offices at incredibly aggressive speeds are all now migrating into this. And and Reef is thinking about, they've partnered with DHL to do electric bike delivery, coming back to some of the trends I talked about earlier. And it raises really interesting questions about what's the sort of the future of mixed use and commercial real estate going to be when instead of building around office and residential, you're now sort of building, or office and commercial, you're now building around basically residential and industrial. So instead of beds and sheds, you might start to see beds above sheds, where like access to a delivery fulfillment center becomes an amenity. I should note that the original Amazon Fresh store in LA opened on the ground floor of a 300-unit luxury apartment building. So we can start to see how that might actually be offered as a service to tenants. And in fact, this comes back to, I don't know if I'm repeating myself here, but I remember this was fresh in my mind, 2 years ago when I was here, and I've been thinking about it since, is Ellie Feingold at Metaprop has this great saying, from street to suite, which is the idea that, you're gonna have to start to see, basically, commercial, managed services that go directly from the street, whether it's deliveries, into the office or the home, and thinking about what these service programs look like, whether it's Zoe or something else. And so here, for example, this is a Walmart worker who's delivering groceries directly into the fridge, and they're wearing a body camera, not to prove security aspects, but so Walmart can collect data on the contents of your fridge. This race to assemble these customer insights and roll it out from there. All right, so I don't know how I'm doing on time. Got 20 minutes left if necessary. But I'm going to come back to a trend that I harped upon a little bit in the last time I spoke to you 2 years ago, because I do feel it's more relevant than ever. And that's what I'm calling higher ground, which is, again, the notion of like how climate change and climate disasters is increasingly gathering steam here on sort of thinking through what these geographic areas will mean. And this is based on several projects I'm working on, conversations I'm having, and it's a conversation that I feel has not entered the mainstream of CRE. So this, just to give you a vista here, I love this time lapse. This was the situation last September, right? Wildfires in the West, 2 active hurricanes in the Atlantic, no big deal, just smoke covering most of North America. And then of course, more recently, the entirety of Texas and the Southern Midwest and the South covered in an ice storm, which will have lasting implications on infrastructure. And is leading, I've been reading news stories about people in Houston thinking about this is just one disaster too many, maybe it's time to leave. Sort of see the weather patterns here. And I've been thinking a lot this past year about, to quote Robert Frost, fire and ice. Some say the world will end in fire. Here's the day the sky turned orange in San Francisco. Some say in ice. Here's the Texas ice storms. We saw during the early days of the pandemic that, there's basically, if we stayed inside and never came out again, we could cut carbon emissions overnight, literally overnight, by 17%. Of course, we had to temporarily destroy 40% of global GDP to do that, but who's counting? But it was surface transportation that was the area that made the biggest cuts in the shortest period of time. The problem is that if we embrace this idea of flight to the cities, we move out of dense cities, we're going to see a massive increase in carbon emissions feeding this feedback loop. Just the switch to SUVs and light trucks have been the second biggest source of climate change over the last decade, more than aviation, more than heavy industry. Only power generation outdoes it. So this is why I go back to, as we started to see mobility patterns, we're seeing aviation pick up again. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. We're going to see a continued appetite for our previous lifestyles and also for risk. And sorry, I recycled the slide here, but you can sort of see here that this is, that basically over the last decade, we've seen people move into higher risk areas when it comes to climate. In California, people have encroached upon the so-called wildland urban interface because they've been priced out of the coastal housing markets where it's slightly more temperate. This is some data from RMS, from Robert Muir Smith there, Robert Muir Woods, who is their chief economist. That basically the number of people who've moved into climate vulnerable areas over the last decade, you can sort of see the percentages, and this ongoing trend of, moving from the Bay to Miami will only continue to feed that if we do in fact see families leave coastal metros to buy larger homes in the Sun Belt. And I should note that, coming back to that large home trend, well, we've also been building back bigger in the hurricane zones. So this gets back to, the fastest growing metros are mostly sprawling. Dallas, Houston, I just mentioned, the ones affected by that. And you can see county population by climate risk, Maricopa County, Arizona, and Harris County, Texas. These are all the areas. And right now, this risk hasn't really been fully priced in, but we're starting to see this recognition of this. And first off, we saw the Trump administration start to acknowledge that, we might actually have to have a flood relocation strategy that would just pencil out entire neighborhoods. We've seen how sort of the wildfire crisis in the West has collided with the housing crisis as well. And then, of course, we're starting to see, movements by the insurers, who are not going to put up with this. For 2 years in a row, the insurance industry has threatened to basically drop coverage on at-risk homes in Central California, to which the state has stepped in and basically issued one-year moratoriums on that. We saw under, again, Trump's CFTC, we saw a report that came out last year, basically arguing that there was systemic financial risk to the entire, to the system from climate change, and subsystemic risk to the real estate industry in particular. And I bring this all up because, while these all make the headlines, when this all gets out there, we've seen the climate risk arms race happening in plain sight here. This gets back to all the data providers, and this is an area that I'm now spending more time in, thinking through about the fact that all of these black boxes are churning away inside of these various funds. And we're not actually having the public discussion about, how do we measure this risk and how that ties into municipal bond ratings and how this ties back into flood insurance and where people will actually live. Literally while we're having this discussion, New Cities was having a call with Swiss Re Institute, which is developing its own metrics for this as well. I'm having a call with AXA that are very eager to talk about this. And I can say, again, so 2 of the companies that I'm working with, one's a very large home developer, thinking through what the climate oases of the future might look like and already preparing a land banking strategy for it. And the other one, the very large mixed use developer, buried in sort of their forward-looking reports, which I'm helping to develop, is the acknowledgement that we might see in the next decade a reversal from the Sun Belt back into the Midwest or other less climate risked areas. And so, this is the sort of current state of play or current projections, as you can see, as compiled by some academic data, which, basically shows that, we'll start to see people leave the highest risk coastal flooding areas, and they will at first closely pack into, the Sun Belt in the South, Atlanta and others. Atlanta was the ultimate recipient of many of the people who left Katrina after 2005, and we'll start to see migrations like this as well. So on that note, I'm giving it back with 15 minutes. I'm glad I could cover some of that time, but these are just some of the areas I wanted to cover here. Some of what I'm thinking about, these proximity cities, nomad cities, the fact that mixed use has been disaggregated, we have to figure out how to put it back together. And again, this idea of like what makes a desirable place, about whether the rules of that game are about to shift under our feet, partly because we don't know what the rules are. So with that, I'll turn off my slides and we can take some questions. This is the part where you tell me that I've been completely inaudible for the last 45 minutes, I think. Okay, I'm glad
you did a fantastic job. That was a lot of information in 45 minutes, man. That was great and all very relevant and got it just a lot of very eye-opening. But so we've got about 13, 14 minutes if we want to stay true to the 1 hour. So please unmute yourself and ask Greg questions.
Greg, hi, I'm here from Las Vegas. You touched on something, how Lennar is changing homes and whatnot. This is something that started, I've observed in my own house pre-pandemic, and I'm curious if you can elaborate on this. I felt like Amazon has been brilliant in that they somehow convinced my wife to sublease about 200 square feet within our home for her shipment, receiving, unpacking, repackaging, returns, and whatnot. Can you allow, I mean, that's like pre-pandemic. Now you're talking about that even more so, and intentionally post-pandemic with work from home options and whatnot. So is there more data? Can you elaborate more on this? Like how the home has changed and will be changing?
Yeah, it's a good question. Good to see you again. I would say that meal we had at Roy Choi's place at Park MGM was probably my favorite meal of 2020. Unfortunately, because there wasn't much after wasn't much of 2020 after that. So good to see you again. Yeah, I mean, let's see, in terms of data on this, I mean, obviously, yeah, Amazon's massive infusion, hiring all these workers. I mean, I've been following sort of the rise, and again, it shows up mostly in sort of survey data. I don't have at my fingertips like the rise of, where Amazon sales are going to and sort of the reshipment stuff. But I think that's extremely emblematic of it in the sense of like, yeah, basically, all of us have designed these rooms for basically receiving areas. We've designed home office areas. And yeah, I mean, when it comes to Amazon's ultimate strategy there, paying attention to, for example, the fact we've seen the rise of micro fulfillment. When I wrote my book Aerotropolis a decade ago, for example, it was about centrally located air hubs and warehouses around them. Then it became warehouses on the edges of cities. Now we're seeing this whole portfolio approach of like basically doing, 1 hour, 15-minute delivery from hubs inside of cities to your house. And, to me, what that speaks to is this larger trend of like, we're dematerializing Main Street and rematerializing it in warehouses somewhere around there. When it comes to your house, I mean, there, the ultimate play is to basically like, yeah, I mean, Proposition 22 in California is sort of enshrine this class of gig workers. Maybe the future of that is basically convincing your wife to continue to run, the equivalent of a small business out of your house there on handling some of this. I'm curious about whether, I don't know where that goes into individual homes. But one last thing on meandering here for a second, I see screen sharing started there. I've been following the trend. This is what Amazon's been up to in India, and this is what Alibaba's been doing in China, where their ultimate end game is to go to mom and pop convenience stores and basically reskin the stores with, full complement of branding and AI. Alibaba's trying to corner the market on 8 million mom and pop shops and basically use their data dynamics to increase sales while taking 40% of revenues. And that's sort of where Amazon's going, I think, with the ghost kitchens, with Amazon Fresh and some of this stuff. For now, they seem content to centralize their portfolio, opening their own stores, but like where DoorDash and Cloud Kitchens, it's all about that. It's about using data to identify locations, outsource the risk, and go from there. In your case, it sounds like they've outsourced the risk into your house. And I don't know. That's a really interesting question there. Is like the ultimate end game is like, is Amazon going to move into like multi-level marketing strategies and like acquire Amway and like the ultimate, like your house does become the distribution center? That's something I'll work into future talks. No, I think
I had an interesting stat that I just uncovered. I'm doing research for a little video that we're working on here at CORFAC. And in 2009, e-commerce equated to about 5% of retail sales in the United States. In 2019, it was 15%. In 2020, it was 35%. Now, of course, COVID had a lot to do with it, but I don't believe we're ever going back to 15% again. But that was a very interesting stat. Great. How about anybody else? Questions?
Joe, I got a question. It's Howard. Greg, what do you think is going to happen in the office sector as vaccines continue to roll out and as people start to go back to the office? I mean, I expect some kind of hybrid where work from home in some form is going to be here for a long time, but I'm curious what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the notion of like, we're having a US discussion here. Like, this is where like pandemic cultural norms and spatiality are all different. Like the French are back at their offices right now, vaccine or not. And so of course, it's most of East Asia. But from a US perspective, I mean, yeah, I mean, like I alluded to, I always thought the notion of like permanent working from the office was a little crazy. I always advise, and maybe I've said this in past talks here, that like, I thought most employers should have a portfolio approach of spaces. And so my hope, I think what's the rational way of doing this is rather than just basically saying we're selling off our offices, you're on your own, or even, you're on your own and here's $10,000 extra bonus, go outfit your home office. We'll see smart employers create these portfolios of spaces. And, you will perhaps work in a remote work hub that's near your house and you drive 15 minutes there. So REI is an interesting bellwether there. They did this. They sold their never used campus in Seattle to Facebook. So there's two trends, like REI saying, we're never going to need this campus. Facebook, which is proclaiming work from home from ever, scooping it up. But REI has already started to open actually a chain of work hubs on the periphery of Seattle, the Seattle metro region. So their first one's out, I think out past the edges of Redmond, for example. And it's, it's adjacent to the highway, it's close to hiking trails. So they're advertising it as very much, indoor, outdoor. So I think that's sort of interesting and emblematic. And that's why I think, we're seeing like, Serendipity Labs. I think Industrious is the way that the future goes for this, for a lot of this. The fact that they're partnering directly with the landlords and the asset owners to manage spaces on their behalf, trying to create a branded national network. They've now got $200 million from CBRE to basically sort of leverage it through them. That's what's going to go beyond WeWork. And I think the next phase of what we're going to see from WeWork and the others is the realization that like the scale, even that WeWork put together for shared workspace wasn't big enough. You have to be everywhere at once, you have to have massively bookable spaces. And my friend Mark Gilbreth, who runs Liquid Space, for example, he's spending all of his time right now answering corporate RFPs on like basically how to put together white label offerings for them so their employees can basically book a space wherever they want to go, whether it's in their office, a shared office, someone else's office, wherever. And I think that's the kind of hybrid forms we're going to see when it comes to how people are going to use space. I think landlords should get to use it. We should start figuring out how like to make your spaces available to anyone and figuring out that this value is going to be disassembled, disaggregated from the tenants into these sort of larger value networks. And then the last thought there I have is like, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what is it going to be, you know, 2 days a week in the office, 3 days, 1 day a week in the office. I don't know. I'll be curious to see like how those trends play out and like how the culture resolves this. I don't think it's as crazy as it sounds, this idea of like going to hybrid models. This is what consultancies did. And that's why I'm sort of curious, like whether we'll start to see more consultancy style hoteling where it becomes normal that you are out in the world doing your projects, you know, doing workflow remotely, and then you come together to spend a day being culture. So yeah, if I had to guess on like how many days a week we'll all spend in the office, I would guess 1 day a week, maybe even less than some, maybe one every other week, because I think culture is important, but like you'll spend that whole day working on culture, like the way the consultants do, and that becomes sort of a re-intake. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
How do you view the fact that Jamie Dimon, for instance, of Chase, says, hey, we've got no collaboration without being in the office. We've got no mentorship. We've got no training, et cetera.
I'm totally sympathetic to that. And like, I mean, I agree. Like, I mean, it's been, you know, we're all here. We spent this year during the pandemic. All of us who are, you know, mid-career have spent this whole time drawing down on all the social capital and network connections we have. I feel terrible for all the kids that have entered the workforce in this, have nothing, no mentorship, no nothing of this. And they're the ones who show up in surveys consistently saying, we want to go back to the office. So yeah, so I think there's totally something to that. And like, you know, I mean, yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether like there are more younger employees in the offices, whether employers will design special onboarding programs for them and everything else. But yeah, you're totally right. And the other thing I think that will come out of that, I know I've talked about this in past talks, is like, you know, we're going to see more workplace surveillance is going to happen as a matter of health. Companies are just going to do it for liability. It will be interesting to see if they finally tie that to the technologies developed to see who you're working with and tie it together and start to see this sort of new data-powered HR model, facilities management model, where like you really understand granularly who's using the space when and all that sort of stuff. So you can tie that back together to figure out like, how do you make a remote hybrid model work so that teams actually can find each other and make sure stuff happens. You know, it'll be interesting to see companies really want to take that on. And maybe they won't have a choice. Maybe their employees will leave them for the companies that will. I know we're going to see a great reshuffling of talent. My favorite stat is that 74% of American workers are sheltering in place when it comes to their jobs. Like they are desperate to quit as soon as things get more stable. So it'll be really interesting to see what that competition looks like.
Greg, I've already heard in Atlanta, just follow up on Howard's point, that young people are starting to quit because they're not getting mentored and not getting collaboration. They're already quitting. People are losing some of the really good young folks because they're not coming back in.
I mean, totally. I mean, I'll tell you, I'm rethinking, you know, my own portfolio of work projects right now as well. Like, you know, I mean, it's one of those things where we've had staff. New Cities is a tiny organization. We've had staff permanently move back to the United States. You know, it's a mess out there, and so. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to like, you know, will we see like culture as a service? Will we see how will these programs actually develop and like onboard it? My favorite is like, I mean, the hardest line is like Goldman Sachs, right? Like, you know, Goldman Sachs and some of the big banks, Jamie Dimon being the other one, being like, we're going back to the office and there's no ifs, ands, or buts. And like, it'll be really interesting to see which ones take a real hard line on culture. And, you know, just as like we've had a natural experiment about, you know, the fact that we can make remote work. We're about to have a natural experiment about what is the real value of physical space and can we actually attribute that to like culture success and employee retention and all of that. So I don't know, as someone who believes that space and design matters, like I'm hoping that it turns out that like being together in proximity with people is key. I mean, but I guess we'll find out.
With that said, same article research I'm working on. A recent Price Waterhouse survey of 669 CEOs, 78% agree that remote collaboration is here to stay forever.
And my response to that statement, and this is where I come down to hardline on this is that, you know, I spent several years of my life trying to work on a book about, you know, engineering serendipity and talking to these CEOs about why they'd gone to open plan offices, Marissa Mayer at Yahoo and others saying, you know, we needed to collaborate, we need to do this. And it turns out they were lying. They were doing it because they wanted to compress their office footprints and save on real estate costs, which is crazy. Like, your people are your most important asset. We should be designing space around them, but they did that. So when all these bank CEOs and tech CEOs within weeks of the pandemic rushed to the conclusion that like, we don't need these office buildings anymore, I just don't believe them when they say that it's for the benefit of their employees. Like, it may turn out that way. We can design space that way, but there was no chance that they actually meant that. So it'll be interesting to see who throws the baby out with the bathwater and who actually makes that model workable.
Greg, Rick Freeling in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Hi, Rick.
We're seeing malls dropping left and right. Everywhere you look, they're going bankrupt. What interesting other uses are you seeing for those? What are some different ideas that people are coming up with around the United States to use those properties for?
There are lots. I mean, so I'm sure you've read all the trends, like, obviously, like Amazon was talking to Simon about converting them to fulfillment centers, conveniently located close to highways, using them for that. There's been whole discussions about, converting it into senior housing, about building off of that. The most interesting one, Epic Games, makers of Fortnite, they bought an entire mall complex in Cary, North Carolina, and converting it to their headquarters. They're even keeping the anchor food and beverage, which I think is really interesting. And, Cary, North Carolina is not exactly a failing suburb there, one of the fastest growing regions in the States. So I think that'll be interesting. I love the idea of malls as corporate campuses, the idea of turning the anchor stores into, perhaps hubs for individual companies, and then having shared amenities in the middle of it where workers can commingle or hang out. Could be really interesting templates there. I also have been following, I think it's been interesting to see the tie-up between Simon, Authentic Brands, and Blackstone, where they trying to create the sort of verticalized roll-up of retail, branding, media, and the mall properties. It'll be really interesting to see, like, if that's one way to try to create value out of this, or you just basically have, what sort of Related did at the very high end with Hudson Yards by buying Equinox, and they have that pet concierge company. So I think we'll see some players try to create like completely verticalized ones where the malls are almost wholly owned by the owners of that, and they're going to try to use their own data plays to extract out of that. But the real answer in the end is like America's just over-malled. I come back to what was it? Will McIntosh at USA Realco told me a while ago. The problem isn't that America's over retail, is that we're under demolished. I think some of that will just have to go. And I hope a lot of it gets turned into housing somehow. It'll be interesting to see if those conversions can actually work. That to me is like one of the big unanswered questions at the moment. Governor Cuomo in New York, basically saying, endorsing the idea that, maybe big swaths of Midtown Manhattan office towers should be converted back to housing. No one's figured out really how to do that affordably or get the numbers to pencil out of that. So it'll be interesting if you can see if you can do it for that, and how you might do that for malls. But it's been done. I've had slides. Howard Hughes developing malls in Alexandria, Virginia. Obviously, in Metro Denver, there's the famous case of Belmar that they tore down parts of the mall and put the street grid back in. Starwood's managing that, or at least it was managing it pre-pandemic quite successfully. So I don't know. That to me will be interesting as well, as like how do you sort of build amenities around that. One last point on that I think is interesting is one of my favorite projects in America is Bellworks, which is the former Bell Labs in New Jersey, 2 million square feet of office, which got turned into a mixed use, innovation space and cafes. They even built housing in the parking lots, and it was designed for people who didn't want to commute all the way into Manhattan, but wanted to commute to a place that felt like a place. So that to me, I think is one interesting strategy. Like how will malls become amenity centers again? And kind of going back to the vision they originally were, which is, self-enclosed downtowns. So we'll see. But yeah, a lot of them are just gone. I think obviously the changes in what Amazon has done and other trends are too great, but the ones that survive will be very crafty in reuse.
Well, the zoning is really tough on getting malls to other uses. I sold a mall in Shannon Mall in Atlanta, had Macy's, Sears, and those kind of things. It was a failed mall. We wound up actually getting the politicians to zone it, and because the mayor was on board with it. But getting zoning's tough. It wound up being a e-commerce building of about 1 million square feet, and also movie studios, so it worked out. But having the politicians that have the political will, and they don't mind getting not reelected if it doesn't go well, that's an issue.
Yeah, that's the hugest thing holding all this back, and something that's come up time and time again, and people I've talked to. I've tried to put together projects at new cities on like imagining, what future 15-minute cities can look like. And whenever I talk to anybody on the private side, commercial side, it's like cities talk a big game, but they don't actually want to innovate. They don't want to relax any of the regulations on curb space or parking or any of this that would allow us to reuse this and think this through. And I don't know, it'll be interesting to see at some point if any of them do relent, if any of them are forward thinking on this and how they're going to do this. Because, just as an aside there, talking about Amazon delivery and some of this, Amazon right now is trying to figure out like, how do you map curb space? Like, and some smart cities are thinking about like, how do we value the curb? Like, can we charge money for curb space if e-commerce now is the future and everything's going to be delivered? And we're going to see Amazon and others use all these assets. UPS and FedEx just pay parking tickets, but like, Amazon doesn't want to do that. They want to have systems in place for this. And the cities are trailing far behind. Private companies are coming in like Coward and Curbflow and creating their own private data layers of public assets to do this. So I don't know, it's another wrinkle on top of this that like if cities don't change the zoning and don't figure this out, that's why you're seeing like cloud kitchens happen, like inserting stuff into the envelopes, or Reef just doing parking lots where they can just drop structures into it. They don't require that kind of zoning and permitting. Unless we see cities make these changes, we're going to start to see these, increasingly Baroque workarounds instead.
Greg, this is Jeff Garibaldi, and I'm the Garibaldi Group here in New Jersey, and I appreciate the fact you raised Bell Works. We've been charged with that responsibility since 2014. We were there from its inception with the developer, and they spent, at the Sims point, they spent every bit of 4.5 years in the town trying to get that property rezoned from a single corporate headquarters to a multiple tenant and a multiple use project. And it clearly that holds true with all of the malls and all these major corporate campuses that are sitting vacant. The municipalities have got to embrace change. They've got to embrace what might be the new workforce coming in here. And the biggest motivator for them is ratables, because absent, any of those properties generating any revenue, they go back off the tax books or they get negotiated down. So it was more by force feeding them that they saw the wisdom. And it was a big political gamble initially this goes back to 2014. It's become the poster child, as I think I mentioned. I'm going to be mentioned because we're talking about adaptive reuse later in this conference. And Bell Works has really been, they set the stage for how well that will take place.
My favorite fact about Bell Works is there's so many dead AT&T campuses in the United States. Like they could buy the one in Hoffman Estates, Illinois, and like they can literally just build a brand around dead Bell campuses. Like it's such a fun joke around.
That's what his objective is, because we are doing it in Hoffman Estates in Chicago right now. And we're out looking around the country for other type of developments like that potential. So.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I'm afraid I have to jump in a second. I've got it's Zoom world, so like I had a 1 o'clock that I'm spilling over, but would love to take one more or two more. I don't know how much more time we have. Joe, I believe you're muted. First time on this call. Get your bingo cards.
Sorry. All right. Well, Greg, we greatly appreciate your insight, your knowledge, your information, and your delivery was all fantastic today. So kudos to you. Thank you again. We're a little over 1, so we'll let you go and get to your next conference. So again, thank you. CORFAC Nation, it's our first session of the spring conference. I think it went very well. So we're back here again tomorrow at noon again for Scott Brown, who is the chief economist from Raymond James. Looking forward to that very much so. So please dial in. And again, don't forget, right on your email, please download the CORFAC app and use it. HQ, anything else?
I just want to say thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Diane, for having me back one last time. So it's been a blast.
You said it was the last time.
And Greg, best to Skip.
Yes, thank you. I was going to say my mother sends her regards, and I owe Susan a call. But yeah, Skip sends her regards to everyone as well. So
we anticipate back again soon. Thank you again, Greg.
All right. Bye. I'll have a great day.
All right.
Well done.
Jonathan, Christy, Jennifer, Diane, anything from HQ? All is good?
All good.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Same time, same place tomorrow for Scott Brown, Chief Economist, Raymond James.